Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Redefining Conservation in the 21st Century. Were most of you at the lunch presentation? Okay, good. As Nick has, I've spent a lot of time with Mike Fay, and I promise you that I'll make no comments about Mike's clothing styles or some of the other things that Nick mentioned. And there's no Jane Goodall stories. But we will try to make this exciting and as engaging as possible. And of course, we're delighted that Mark Tercek, President and CEO of the Nature Conservancy, is able to join us today. Mark became president in July of 2008. He's had an 8-year career prior to that at Goldman Sachs. He was previously managing director of Goldman Sachs, where he headed the firm's Center for Environmental Markets and the Environmental Strategy Group. Now, the Nature Conservancy was started in 1951, and the question that has to be asked, Mark, is why leave Goldman Sachs before the collapse, I might add, and join the Nature Conservancy?
Okay, thanks, Chris. It's nice to be here. I'm happy to talk about that. But first, let me say thank you for coming. I know we're competing with an awfully beautiful day out there, so it's nice of you to be here. Thanks, National Geographic and Aspen Institute, for a great conference. My colleagues from the Conservancy have really been happy to be here. But what I really want to say is thanks to all of you who are supporters of the Conservancy or the other great conservation organizations, CI, WWF, WCS. The one thing I've really learned since I got started in this business is how extraordinary our supporters are. Generous, engaged, passionate, and everything we do is thanks to our supporters. So I know there's some supporters out there of the broad conservation movement. Thank you very much. We're very mindful of how generous and committed our supporters are, and we know they have a whole range of things they could support. So we really, I think I speak for all the organizations in our movement. We're really mindful and appreciative of that. Now about Goldman Sachs. I worked at Goldman Sachs for 25 years. I worked there a long time. So right when the job was first announced, my transition to TNC, it was announced in May. And back then, people would say to me, gosh, why would you leave Goldman Sachs to join the Nature Conservancy? And of course, nowadays people say, hey, nice timing. But the answer is, so when it was announced, I came home from work, and my 10-year-old son said, hey, Dad, I checked out the webpage of your new company. It's a pretty cool job you have. Your job is to save the planet. And that's not exactly how we say it, but basically that's what it's all about. So why did I come to the Conservancy? I believe passionately in the Conservancy's mission of protecting biodiversity. I don't think there's any other organization with the resources we have. And to have the opportunity to lead the Conservancy, particularly at this moment in time, was incredibly exciting. So I really feel fortunate. I think I have one of the best jobs in the world. And then about Goldman Sachs and TNC, a lot of people think it's weird, like, gosh, what a strange transition. But I don't think it's so weird, and it feels kind of natural to me. So it's a funny time. It's a funny time to speak highly of investment banks. I get that, given everything that's going on, but just humor me, because again, I spent 25 years at Goldman Sachs. The nature of investment banking is it's the business of getting things done. That's what you really do there. You think, we have research folks, we advise people, we do all sorts of things as investment bankers, but you only get paid when you get things done. So it's a really practical business. And my job at Goldman Sachs, as I rose up in the organization, I had different leadership jobs. And my job was to try to mobilize people around the world, very entrepreneurial, hard-driven, smart people, very ambitious. And we would pursue really complex transactions, high degree of difficulty assignments. We'd collaborate with other organizations. We didn't shy away from tough stuff. Indeed, we wanted the toughest assignments we could find. That's what investment banking was about. And I thought I got pretty good at leading an investment banking effort. And what we do at the Conservancy is not so different. It's not a perfect analogy, I know, but at the Conservancy and at the other conservation organizations, we try to take on really tough assignments. This time, we're trying to protect habitat for purposes of biodiversity conservation. Try to mobilize people all around the world. We're very entrepreneurial. We try to be very creative. We're always looking for new strategies and tactics. And so the two businesses are not as different as you might think. So it feels like a pretty good transition. It's hard work. It's really fulfilling. And I guess that's what I would say about the transition. That's how I got here, and so far so good.
One thing I'm curious about, a few years ago, I was having dinner with a very successful investment banker who said he wanted to start a second career as a photographer. And of course, I was doing everything I could to discourage him. But he was asking a lot about National Geographic. And he said, does National Geographic suffer from nonprofit-itis? And I said, well, the magazine I don't think does, because we're in the marketplace competing. We've got competitors from all over the world. We're competing for people's time. I don't think we do, but that is a good question, because if we were a for-profit organization, would we be different? And I'm very curious, you coming from the private sector and then now coming into the nonprofit sector, just how you, the chemistry changes you see.
Yeah. It's really interesting, Chris, and I can't help but think about it all the time. I could go on and on, but there are a lot of differences, and there are some challenges in the nonprofit world that I didn't appreciate until I joined the Conservancy. So when I was interviewing for the job, the board had a really rigorous interviewing process, and they kept pressing me, how good was I at setting priorities, how had I set priorities as a business person? And I had good answers. I think I was a pretty good business person, and we had good tools to evaluate projects, profit margin, IRR, return on investment. And any decent business person will rank the different things that he or she can do, and you drop the bottom ones and you focus your resources on the important ones. But what I've come to understand is that's a lot harder in the nonprofit world, or at least it's a lot harder in the conservation world. Everything we do is worthy. We don't do bad things. And we're awash with opportunity. There's so much to do. And we've got great mission-driven people around the world, and they keep finding one great opportunity after another. We want to do them all. But we have to be really careful about spreading ourselves too thin. I think a lot of organizations like ours, you can have project proliferation. And we want to be really smart and disciplined about, doing a really good job at the things we need to do. And that's especially true right now in a more difficult time, when we're always going to be resource constrained, but we have fewer resources today. So right now at the Conservancy, we're working really hard, but it's not easy to try to set our priorities so we're crystal clear about what the things are that we're really going to do well. We're going to make sure we have the resources to do them. And then, we hope we'll have, we'll keep raising additional resources that will allow us to take on new things. But that's one thing. But there are a lot of differences. One of my jobs as a banker was working with companies who would be going public, and I would say to a CEO, here's what I need from you, Mr. CEO or Ms. CEO. I need 4 weeks of your time, a couple days to prepare. We'll be on the road for 3 weeks, then a couple days to tie up the deal. You'll have an infusion of capital. And after that, I'll need 1 day a quarter. We'll have, your earnings release. You'll talk to analysts. And then, 2-3 years down the road, when you need another infusion of capital, we'll go back on the road. But in nonprofit land, we're on the road every day. I'm not complaining. It's fun, and it's good to be in touch with our investors, but it's a challenge. So I could go on the differences. Right now for the Conservancy, though, we're trying to be really smart about setting clear priorities that make sense so that we can be good stewards of our donors and supporters' capital and make really important things happen that are game-changing.
Well, in this environment we're in, which is challenging to say the least for all of us. I mean, we at National Geographic have had layoffs really almost for the past 12 months. I know that you've had the unfortunate situation where you've had to do some similar things. I mean, how optimistic are you right now about TNC's position and your ability to move forward on your mission?
I'm quite optimistic. I think my colleagues are too, but that's a complicated question you asked. So first about layoffs, it's true we had to make some layoffs, and I don't want to be lighthearted about this. I mean, we attract great people. It's one of the great things about TNC and the other conservation organizations, and so to let anybody go is a sad thing. Now the good news is the world needs smart environmentalists and conservationists today. So we think our colleagues are going to land on their feet in good situations, but layoffs was not something we did lightheartedly. Having said that, though, once you move past the hard part of layoffs, in the private sector, you like business downturns. You don't ever say that aloud if you're a leader, but it's a time to tighten things up, go on a little bit of diet, streamline, be smart about how you're doing business. So for the Conservancy, I think it's a really good opportunity to rethink things. So we're doing that. And about that, I feel really good. But then about optimism, yeah, we feel pretty optimistic. Now, we're not Pollyannish. We get that there are, some really huge threats out there that are against our mission of biodiversity conservation. So we're not Pollyannish. On the other hand, though, our job is to get stuff done. So we're really too busy getting things done to have time to be pessimistic. And the more we do, and the more we try different approaches, the more optimistic we get. So here's one example: the Great Bear Rainforest. So the Great Bear Rainforest, that's the huge area north of Vancouver, on the central and northern coast of British Columbia, right up to Alaska. And you'll remember, not that many years ago, it was the place where there were really vitriolic wars between environmentalists, logging industries, indigenous people. It was a mess. And if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, and the Nature Conservancy said, we think we can fix that up and make it a great protected area, I think people would be very skeptical. But that's kind of what happened. A couple of years ago, lo and behold, a great coalition comes together, importantly, First Nations people, some good NGOs, local ones, small ones, the Nature Conservancy, so we were the big guy, some enlightened leaders in the government. And what's also cool about this is it had a kind of deal aspect to it. So again, it reminds me of my old life. But the basic deal was the following. If the Conservancy, with some other NGOs, could raise $60 million in 2 years, the federal government and the provincial government of BC would each kick in $30 million apiece. So we'd have $120 million. So that was, and the Conservancy, working with these other NGOs, we got it done thanks to our supporters. The First Nations people, I think 21 out of 24 groups of First Nations people contributed their land. And so we have this huge area now. It's like 21 million acres. It's huge. I was just there, so it's really unbelievable. 21 million acres of beautiful temporal forests, pristine. In the past, site of terrific, tremendous wars between environmentalists, loggers, et cetera. Today, 1/3 of that land is protected. The other 2/3 will be sustainably managed in a way that I think you could be very comfortable. The outcomes are going to be good from a conservation perspective, with the cooperation of the First Nations people who live there. And what's also cool about this deal, so we have $120 million. About half of that money is for traditional conservation, science work, protection, et cetera, just like you would expect. The other $60 million is for economic development, or really human development. So the people who live there, they need livelihoods. They need to work. They used to work for logging companies. And so we're funding and developing sustainable livelihoods in tourism, in high-end tourism, in fisheries, in taking care of the forests, you name it. And we're not really done. It's off to a really successful start, but it's not like we can declare victory. What will make us successful is if that funding for the First Nations people really work, and we can really produce livelihoods for those people over time that will keep this great area sustainably managed. But I was just there. Sanjan was with me. So I'm on the road raising capital a lot. It gets tiring sometimes, but there are some perks. So Sanjan and I and a few of our important supporters were on a boat in the Great Bear Rainforest. I get up early in the morning. I'm sitting in the front of the boat. The mist is out there. Sun's coming up. I've got a cup of coffee. I'm watching grizzly bears, reach into the water, pulling out salmon for breakfast. And I say, hey, compares pretty favorably to working on Wall Street. But anyway, a story like Great Bear, I think, has to make you optimistic. So again, in the past, you would have said, wow, how can you make something happen? Some clever, creative, hardworking people who aren't afraid of a tough challenge dig in, and I don't know how you can't react to that story, saying, yeah, there's a lot to be optimistic about. And so that's our experience at the Conservancy. That's what we do. Now maybe we're in a period where we'll have less capital, so we'll use different strategies. So here, another story. So this is pretty cool because it doesn't cost us any money. Now over to Ecuador, Quito. So you have the city of Quito. Anybody who goes to the Galapagos will have been there. Big city, needs clean water, industrial users of water. The watershed is the Biocondor Reserve, so important place. So the Conservancy persuades the industrial users of that water to create a fund. The fund then goes up to basically the farmers upstream. We ask them to improve their agricultural practices, less fertilizer runoff, less waste runoff, plant trees to avoid sedimentation, et cetera. And it works. But what's really cool about this, I didn't even know this part of it. Peter Cariva, who's our scientist, he's here, lead scientist, was telling me, another part of the funding was used for education. So something like 42,000 school kids in Ecuador got environmental training by way of this fund. And that investment worked so well that the people of Quito then voted. They voted to tax themselves. And so the fund is even bigger now, so that even more money is going to protect that watershed, resulting in clean water for the residents of Quito. So pretty cool deal, but so cool then that we're replicating it. So now we're doing the same, very same kind of project in Bogota. And again, 5 or 6 years ago, I probably would have thought, gosh, would Bogota do that kind of project? So there really is room for optimism. Smart people in the conservation field, sponsored by generous, enlightened donors, partnering with smart governmental leaders, working effectively with local people. These projects only work if the people who rely on nature there are part of the programs. You add that all up, and it's good reason for optimism, notwithstanding the big threats we're facing.
If I could interject a story, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and I've loved that Great Bear region for years. And I was up there working, and had been told about a rodeo up there at a place called Anaheim Lake. And this rodeo was about a 3 or 4 hour drive on a so-so dirt road from Williams Lake. And I went back there, and it was like a step back in time. It was Chilcotin Caribou Country, I think is part of what that's called. And it was just a hoot. I mean, these old high rail fences, and it was literally like rodeos must have been 70 or 80 years ago. And I was photographing there and had a bunch of cameras, and a gentleman came up to me and said, what are you doing here? And so I didn't really look like a local, I don't think. And he said, I said, well, I'm working on a story in the Fraser River for National Geographic magazine. So he interviewed me, and I didn't think anything of it. Then about 2 weeks later, I was in a bar to meet an Indian who was going to do some salmon fishing, and I was going to photograph salmon fishing. Of course, it's a really rich fishery. It's on the road to Bella Coola. And I'm sitting, and it was the Indian guy had asked me to meet him in a pretty shady bar. I mean, it was not really a place that you'd want to be associated with very much. And I was kind of in a back corner, and I was wearing a cowboy hat and kind of sitting there with a pull down my head, waiting for this guy, watching the door, the kind of place where you want to have your back against the wall and keep an eye on the door. And so a guy comes up to me, a big strapping guy, and says, "Are you from National Geographic?" I'd never seen this guy before in my life. And I said, "Why do you ask?" And he said, "Well, because I heard there was some guy around here from National Geographic." And I said, "Yeah, but how did you know I was from National Geographic?" And he said, "Because you've got an out-of-town hat." So it's a wonderful part of the world.
It's really good.
Yeah, we're working on a story right now on the ghost bear. Yeah, Paul Nicklin is. So
fantastic.
Yeah, so we'll keep you in mind when we're up to that. One thing that I'm curious about. When I worked in Hawaii in particular, I did a lot of work with the Nature Conservancy, and I was really impressed with the good work you were doing there, have been for years. And I have to say that in September 2001, when the Washington Post published the 2-year investigative piece on the Nature Conservancy, I was pretty surprised, frankly. And I just wondered, out of that experience, what did you all learn from it? What was the big takeaway?
Yeah, I think it was a good experience. I mean, I wasn't at the Conservancy then, and I don't know if people all remember the story. But basically, Conservancy, again, we're trying to get stuff done, right? That's our motto. Well, that isn't really our motto. I guess that's my motto. We have a fancier motto than that. Scratch that. They're not going to let me out and do any more primetime presentations. Anyway, we try to get stuff done. And so to get things done, you need to collaborate with people. And we're not afraid of that. So we're always collaborating, always partnering. And there's risks in doing that. And we always will have to be careful to do that right. And I'll talk about some of the interesting partnerships we're doing. But anyway, as it happens, the stuff the Washington Post investigated, we were a younger organization then. We were growing like gangbusters, and we were doing a lot of transactions. And we weren't quite as punctilious as we needed to be about kind of monitoring and reviewing and documenting every aspect of it. So some of the transactions looked a little bit sloppy. We didn't really do anything, evil or wrong. But we were a little sloppy in terms of documentation and being ready to defend ourselves. All things, though, said, it was good for the Conservancy. So anyway, at the time, my old boss, Hank Paulson, was the chairman of the Conservancy. And he basically instituted Goldman Sachs-like risk management practices for the Conservancy, and it was, I think it was tough for the organization, to be in the spotlight like that. But those practices live on, and so we feel very good about our risk management. We feel very good about when we enter partnerships. And we enter partnerships. We work all the time with big companies And some folks say, gosh, shouldn't you be wary of being accused of green mail and that sort of thing? But we're not afraid. If a potential partnership will allow us to scale up and get more done, we're interested. So here's an example that I think is pretty cool, because we need new strategies, right? We need to get things done on a bigger scale, and we need to move quickly because we're up against some tough forces. So in Wyoming, the Jonah Field is a really important place for exploration for natural gas. So BP is doing exploration in the Jonah Fields, and lo and behold, they discover there's even more natural gas than they had thought would be there. So they went back to regulators to see whether they could do more mining. And the regulators said, okay, you can, but you'll have to spend a certain amount of money, and the amount of money was like $25 million, to offset any environmental harm you did. They turned to us to be a partner. So they came to us. We did some really cool work with them, offsetting their exploration activities in a way that's really scientifically valid. So our scientists drove that project. But what's great from that collaboration is now BP has come to us voluntarily. The first time they were mandated. Now they've come to us voluntarily and said, hey, let's explore more opportunities like that. Because exploration companies like BP, I believe, get that they don't have a permanent license to operate. The communities where they work are increasingly around the world going to want them to be thoughtful, good environmental citizens. And this is complicated stuff, but we think there's a pretty important opportunity for us to partner with folks like that. So we have a new partnership with Shell. Now, it's just getting underway. And Shell has a controversial reputation in environmental circles. But I've met with the CEO a few times. I think they're sincere. He told the story to me this way. He said the way they often do things is they spend a lot of time identifying a place where they want to go do some work. They believe that it's legal to do so. They're all ready to go. Then an environmental organization shows up and sues them. Everything comes to a halt. They go to court. Shell spends a lot of money on lawyers, although Shell can afford it. The environmental guys spend a lot of money on lawyers. Tough for them to afford, but they do it too. They go to court. Shell usually prevails because it was legal in the first place, but the CEO told me along the way they often learned things that had they known up front, they could have designed the project on a better basis, still achieving their business outcome, but having a lot less environmental impact. And so he said, how about we try working together up front and see whether your science can advise us ahead of time. And we're not naive. We're not naive, and we know that there's risks here, but all our work's going to be driven by science. It's all going to be published. And I'm hopeful that we can work together with Shell. Shell's environmental footprint can be improved. And if we can do good work with Shell, then maybe we can work with, we have a big presence in China, maybe we can work with those companies. And it could be a new strategy going forward to do important work on a really big scale. But we'll be at risk of Washington Post-type inquiries. But this time around, we'll be prepared to explain clearly why we did what we did and why we're comfortable doing so.
Well, I think it's a challenge that all of us who are in nonprofits face. I mean, literally, we at National Geographic and the Aspen Institute are associated with Shell as well, with General Motors, with Duke Energy. And I remember a conversation we had a few years ago when Walmart had come up with a program about wetlands and the surface areas of their stores and trying to save, I think, wetlands in particular, if I remember correctly. And there was quite a large debate internally. Well, Walmart, do we want to be associated with Walmart because they wanted to make this announcement at National Geographic headquarters and be associated, quite honestly, with our brand and the strength of our brand. And it was a very interesting discussion internally because as a photographer magazine guy, I think a thing I would share in common with you is that I'm a pragmatist. I want to be effective. I want to get stuff done. I want a magazine out there that excites people, that is relevant, that is adding insight, and we want to push that as much as we can. And my feeling was, look, Walmart's really basically doing the right thing. I mean, they may have other labor problems, all other kinds of problems, but if they're at least on face value trying to do the right thing, why wouldn't we as a nonprofit who shares a lot of the values that TNC does, why wouldn't we endorse that? Why wouldn't we say that's a good thing and let it happen at our headquarters?
Yeah, listen, we're on the same page. It's not like business interests will always overlap with environmental ones, so you need to be careful. But if you think about it like a Venn diagram, there's business interests here, there's environmental interests here. I think there's a very big area of overlap. So that's where the Conservancy focuses. We recognize there'll be other areas where there'll be real conflict. And in my old life at Goldman Sachs, this is exactly what we came to experience. First, we experienced it firsthand. The more Goldman Sachs tried to find win-win opportunities, good for the business and good for the environment. We found many more than we thought we could, and then we started, preaching that philosophy to our corporate clients, and there's a lot of opportunity out there for that kind of stuff. And the Conservancy is going to, mine it. Here's an interesting example of the same kind of thing. And I told this story to a few people at the conference, so I'll be repeating myself perhaps. But now we go to China. So David Harrison is here. David's one of our experts in rivers and dams. And it's another example of a new strategy to do conservation on a big scale, and for us, less capital intensive. So here our partner is the Three River Gorges Dam Company and the Chinese government. Dams on the Yangtze River have two purposes, if you simplify. One, generate hydropower, and two, provide flood protection. The problem, though, those two objectives are in conflict. If you want to maximize power production, you fill the reservoir, and that results in maximum power production. But of course, if the reservoir is full, there's no room to absorb floodwaters. So they keep the reservoir at half full, then you have flood protection, but sadly you forego some hydro production. So our scientists looking into this go downstream and see an enormous opportunity for wetlands restoration. And if those wetlands are restored, they do a whole bunch of good things: biodiversity, livelihoods for the people who live there, but flood protection as well. That's the way Mother Nature designed it. Those wetlands can absorb the water. So here's what we're working on in China right now. The Three River Gorge Company funds investment in restoration of wetlands. That allows the reservoir to be full to generate more hydropower. The revenues from that incremental power are more than enough to pay for that wetlands restoration. And voila, we've created a new way a win-win way for business to fund conservation. And if it works, and we really think it will work, complicated to be sure, but we think it works, you can roll that out then all over the place. I mean, this again, David Harris. You should wave, David. This is the great work of David Harrison. But for us, that's exciting. But here, we're cooperating with business. And, again, you could perhaps, a more radical environmentalist might critique us for this kind of engagement. But we see so much opportunity in that kind of venture.
And also, if that dam's more efficient in producing hydroelectric power down the road,
you don't need as many dams.
You need fewer dams.
Exactly.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit, Mark, please, about what TNC is doing relative to one of the great issues of our time, climate change.
I think we're doing a lot. This is kind of a cool story, I think. So the way the Conservancy does its business is we call it conservation by design. So we identify the threat, and then we think about the best tools to address the threat. So traditionally, the threat was, say, loss of habitat through development or something. And so our classic move would then be to protect that habitat, buy an area, create a protected area. So then, lo and behold, climate change comes along. And climate change is this huge, enormous threat. What's the best way to deal with that threat? And this time it's public policy. So it's a little bit of a difference for us. We've always been very engaged in public policy, but it's usually been kind of below the radar screen stuff, focused on tax policy for conservation easements, that kind of stuff. Very important, but not headlined, front page stuff. But when climate change comes along, we say, wow, biggest threat, climate change. We need to do something about it. We care about conservation. And so we engage in policy. And it's been very interesting for me because when I was interviewing for the job, the board asked me about this too, and in particular, they asked about the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, U.S. CAP. That's a coalition of some 25 companies, big companies, and a couple of NGOs trying to come together on recommendations for Congress and the Obama administration on climate policy. And by the way, we pulled that off. I'll come back to that. But when I was being interviewed, I said, gosh, I don't know why that U.S. CAP needs the Conservancy. You're a conservation organization. Environmental Defense, NRDC, the World Resources Institute, they're part of U.S. CAP. Couldn't they provide all the advocacy and expertise that's needed? But anyway, the way U.S. CAP worked is in order to reach consensus fast, the CEOs had to go to the meetings. So I got the job, I started going to the meetings, and then right away I saw the difference the Conservancy makes. So we'd be in the room debating policy things, and the topic of avoided deforestation would come up. So that's the notion of developed countries paying the rainforest countries to protect their rainforests so that you sequester carbon and you get all the extra great benefits that we love, biodiversity, protection for the people who live there, et cetera. So for a conservation organization, we're very excited about avoided deforestation. The challenge is there's a whole bunch of issues, and they're real issues. How confident can you be about the amount of carbon that is sequestered? How confident can you be that it will be permanently sequestered? How sure can you be that the dollars will flow all the way down to the local people so that they don't
deforest. I mean, deforestation is already illegal most of the time, so the people who live there have to benefit from it. So that's where a conservation organization like us enters the picture. Not just us, the other guys are doing this too. And so we do projects on the ground to try to prove that this can really work. So we did one project in Bolivia, Noel Kempf. This happened in like 1996, we got started or so. Funded by some American companies. Initial project pretty small, but we showed that it worked. The carbon's been sequestered, the forests have been protected, the dollars are flowing through to the local people. And so that allows us then in this policy debate to kind of pound the table and say, this really works, you can count on this. So now we have another project like this underway in Indonesia. It's much bigger, it's much higher degree of difficulty. It's not easy. But again, we're pretty confident it can work. We have the cooperation in Indonesia of the federal government, the state government, the local government, the leaders of the local people, sustainable forestry operators. We have all the expertise we've accumulated from doing forest deals for 50 years. So we apply all that in Indonesia, and then we bring it back to the policy debate. So anyway, long-winded answer on climate change. We're fighting for forests. We're fighting for nature-based adaptation. I mean, look, climate change is inevitable. So a lot of dollars are going to be invested in preparing against climate change. And we think some of the best ideas or opportunities will be in ecosystems. Mangroves to protect against rising sea levels or storms, et cetera. So we fight for that. And again, we point to our experience on the ground, so we can do so with confidence. And then we can do one other thing, and this is kind of new for us too. But we have 50 state chapters. Each of our chapters has a board. So we have like some 1,500 trustees in America. These are people who are passionate about conservation. And they're a real cross-section of people. We did a survey. They're like 50-50 Democrats and Republicans. They're business people, academics, conservationists. And so now we're getting them engaged. And we're saying, okay, here's our perspective as a conservation organization about climate change. Understand our points of view and talk to your elected officials. And so we're trying to make a difference there too.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is, we've got a microphone at the center here, is I'd like to open it up for questions.
Okay.
Please.
Hi, my name is Samira. I live in Chicago right now. I work for the Department of Transportation with their pedestrian and bicycle program. But I understand that the Nature Conservancy has thousands of projects they could be working on. And I was wondering how, you said you were trying to streamline now, get a smaller amount of projects that you focus more on. And I was wondering, how do you decide what projects you want to work more on? What do you want to focus on? Is there criteria that you set?
It's really a great question. Everybody could hear the question, how do we set priorities? I don't have a simple answer. It's hard. I'll tell you, it's hard. But we think we know what we're doing, right? So our mission is biodiversity protection. And then further, and this is important for us, we're committed to all habitat types. So different organizations have different strategies. We want to protect all biodiversity. So we've divided the world into 5 habitat types: forests, marine, freshwater, arid lands, deserts, and grasslands. And those last 2 are important to note. Deserts and grasslands. There are not a lot of national parks of grasslands and arid lands, but they're important stores of biodiversity. So we're committed to 5 habitat types, so that drives our thinking. And then you say, yeah, but you still have a long way to go to narrow down what you do. And so then we think about things like the enabling factors. Are we pretty confident if we take on a project we can succeed? We want to be careful we don't get bogged down and waste our time and not get things done. We're interested in things that can be kind of iconic and big so that the world will take notice so that we can replicate them. Those are some more criteria. And then we have a geographic strategy too. We're not everywhere. And it's kind of an evolution. But for example, we have really in Asia, I'll just talk about Asia by way of example. We have strong presences in China, in Indonesia, in Australia, and in the Coral Triangle area. So we're quite interested in folks. So if you brought me a great opportunity today in India, sadly we would say no. We'd say, well, we'd love to be in India, but we're not there right now. We can't take that on. So that's another factor. And we kind of juggle those things. And then I think there'll be some new considerations as we go forward, because it's really interesting to not have the capital we've had. Our business model is really capital intensive. Last year, we raised $500 million for our operating budget and another $500 million for our capital budget. That was a big year on the capital side, but $1 billion. We can't always do that, or at least in this environment. So now we think about strategies that are less capital intensive too. So some of the things I talked about excitedly,
I was excited because they don't require as much capital, because we could grow faster. So we kind of sort our way through that. It's hard, though, because our people are all over the world, passionate, mission-driven, and they keep finding great opportunities, and saying no is really difficult. And then another thing we're going to do, we've always collaborated well with the other conservation organizations, but I think we want to take that even further. So we do a lot of things together, but now maybe we'll do some things like the following, like, sadly, we can't do everything, so we'll say, look, we're both here. Why don't you, CI, take on this place, and we'll take on this place, and you can exit. That might be another opportunity for efficiency. And then the last thing I'll mention is new kinds of collaborations. We haven't talked about it too much in this session, but you've heard about it through the conference. Our work, especially overseas, but really everywhere, it only succeeds if the local people benefit from our projects. And so then as you think about it, a lot of our work really in developing countries is economic development work and human development work. And we're an organization that hires biologists and environmentalists. So we're trying to explore now whether we should be partnering more with people like CARE and Oxfam. And maybe that'll turbocharge some of our work. So these are some of the ways we think about that.
Excuse me. Hi, Andy Hoffman, University of Michigan.
Hi.
In the spirit of the title of the session, Conservation in the 21st Century, there's a schism forming in the environmental movement between the bright greens and the dark greens. Bright greens work with business, work with the market system. Dark greens, the market system is the problem. You guys are the brightest of the bright greens. There's a lot of criticism coming towards you. A new book, Green Ink, another one, Sustainability Hijacked. Even Gus Speth, who's been saying that maybe the environmental movement's become too consensus-oriented and needs to get a little more aggressive. How do you see that tension between the dark greens and the bright greens? And I think we also have to factor into this that the dark green voice is getting tamped down. All the money's on the bright green side. What does that bode for the future of the environmental movement?
Well, by the way, I'm not sure I agree with you on Gus Speth exactly. I know Gus, and I've read his stuff. I think he's pretty supportive of our work. He acknowledges there's big challenges ahead, but I don't think he would be critical of the kinds of projects I just described.
Well, not you specifically, but he has been saying that as fast as the environmental movement learns to swim, the river's getting faster and they're losing ground.
Yeah, so anyway, my answer to your question is we have an interesting ecosystem of environmental organizations, and there's a role for everybody. So when I was at Goldman Sachs, I paid a lot of attention to and had a good relationship with Rainforest Action Network. I don't know if you guys know Rainforest Action Network ran well. So they're not in the bright green category. But they're really an impressive organization. So it's this tiny little organization. They have a very small budget. And they're in the business of running campaigns against corporations to scare the bejesus out of their CEOs so their behavior will change. And, there's a role for that. All they really do is they use pretty rough tactics to get the attention of a CEO. They go right for the top. They're very effective at getting the attention of the CEO. The CEO pays some attention to them. They steer them to folks like us, and good things flow from that. And so I have no problem with that. I don't know if they're in your dark green category now, but I know Rand pretty well. I have all the time in the world for Mike Bruin, their leader. He is a good person. He's a courageous, good person trying to make the world a better place. And I think if he were up here right now, he would be very supportive of the stuff we're doing. It's very complementary. So I don't see it as much as a schism. But for us, you heard me right off the top. We're optimistic, and we really want to get things done. We don't really spend a lot of time on debating philosophically what we should or shouldn't be doing, because we agree with Gus. The clock is running. It's not in our favor. We want to get as much done as we can, as fast as we can. And so we kind of leave for others to have those debates. We pay some attention. We respect all the players. All these folks are doing, I'm still a newcomer to the field, but everybody I meet in the field, takes my breath away. These are exhilarating people trying to do good work. And it's not like there's a textbook that tells us what to do, right? It's a very dynamic playing field, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. I think there's room for everybody. See, one person agreed with me. Thank you. I'll take it.
Hi, my name is Elise Huddle, and I'm a graduate student at Columbia University under the Earth Institute. Last semester, I was working on a project with a professor looking at environmental attitudes towards adoption of wind energy the wind industry in Germany. And one of the hypotheses that came out of that research project for myself was that In Germany, the environmental groups, there's only a few really strong ones, and in the United States, we're so fractured. We have so many. And there's a few that are sort of at the top that are really well known, brand is very recognized, and there's a lot of groups down at the bottom doing great work, but not really well known. And I'm curious, sort of dovetailing on the previous gentleman's question, what your thoughts are in terms of both finances in a tough economy, where you have a model that's dependent on donations, as well as sort of public opinion, having so many different groups working on so many things, so much overlap between groups. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not like I'm an expert on that, but first of all, about all the groups, including small ones, these small groups are often really great partners of ours. So they'll be, a lot of times conservation is really local. So we're doing some work in Africa right now with some African-based organizations. They're great, and they've got great local capabilities, but they're trying to do some big transactions in which some of our expertise is very helpful. So we team up, and 1 + 1 is more than 2. So in a lot of respects, again, back to my prior comment, I think there's room for everybody. In terms of confusing, the landscape being confusing, it's true for nonprofit land. It frustrates me too. I miss the market economy I used to work in, where information was so good. There are very sophisticated ways to tell which companies are good and which ones are not good. The bad ones go away. The good ones attract capital and people and go on and prosper. Nonprofit land's not as clear there, and there's probably opportunity to do something about that. I encourage the Aspen Institute guys to have a conference on those kinds of topics. And then the last thing I would say is there is good news in bad economic times for the nonprofit world and at least for the conservation world. If capital is not going to be quite as easily available, then it requires us to come up with new strategies. So I've talked about some of them. And it requires us to think hard about how we work with one another. We work pretty well with one another already, but I think we can get even better. So those are some of the things we're doing in response.
Another thing I might add to that is if you go through the history of a lot of the prominent conservation organizations in the United States, I'll use CI as an example. The people who started CI had been at other conservation organizations.
As a matter of fact, they were.
And from my perspective, that's a good thing. Because what it means is an entrepreneurial spirit. They see an opportunity in another way. Let the organization they're with at the time prosper and carry on. And then we see a need to do this, and we see a way to do it, so let's tackle it. But I do have to say that I really endorse what you and CI and WCS, a lot of people are trying to do right now, where the pie is only so big, really.
Yeah. And
I think it's a very healthy thing to not duplicate efforts. But it's also good to have a little healthy competition.
Competition is a good thing, yeah. It's different than the private sector. So we compete a little bit, but one good thing about having these different organizations is we learn from one another, and that's a healthy thing. And it eliminates complacency. Hi, Carter.
Hi, Mark.
I'm preparing for a tough question.
No, I'm your friend. I think most of us in this room realize or believe that climate change could wipe out 50 years of great success on the part of the Conservancy. It's going to be probably very, very strong as it comes, and just a few degrees makes a big difference. And species adaptation is not going to be a sufficient response. It'll be a partial response, but not a sufficient response, which brings us to the topic of policy. And as you noted, TNC, before you joined, did become a member of U.S. CAP. U.S. CAP came out with a point of view in favor of a cap-and-trade system and free giveaway of allowances, which, as you know, I don't think is a good idea. But it is a U.S.-oriented entity, and 90% of the world's biodiversity is outside the U.S., and you could argue that 90% or more of the threat that climate change brings to the natural world is also outside of the U.S. So the whole issue of international or non-U.S. policy becomes an important topic for TNC also, I would argue. And particularly when you go outside of the U.S. in the areas where most of the biodiversity and forests and grasslands lie that really make a difference in helping to turn back climate change, you're running into lots of real problems, including powerful economics that are driving these countries in another direction. So you have to begin to really engineer economic incentives, or you're going to see deforestation go on. Now, deforestation is now 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, except in a dry year with forest fires, it goes up to 35%. And put on top of that what poor agricultural practices with methane out of cows and so forth produce. So it's a major, major issue. And I think the Conservancy is distinctly positioned to play a positive role in trying to shape sensible economic strategies for protecting forests and other carbon sequestration opportunities outside of the U.S. And I was going to ask you to address the subject of how TNC will be playing that role going forward, particularly since it is committed to the so-called 2015 goal, which is to try to protect, as I understand it, 10% of all ecosystems around the world. And of that set of ecosystems, a lot of them are under dire, indeed deadly threat from climate change.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Thank you, Carter. And yes, Carter's exactly right. I talked about the 5 habitats we seek to protect, and we do have the very bold goal of trying to, with others, not by ourselves, to protect 10% of each of those habitat types. And on climate change, so therefore, we understand the threats as Carter described them. That's persuaded our board to fully support high-profile engagement in policy in a way that's different in the past. I talked about U.S. CAP. We're very focused in the U.S. just because we want to be practical again. We want to push very hard for real movement in the U.S. prior to the important Copenhagen negotiations at the end of this year. But at Copenhagen, Carter, we will be there full force. You know, Chris asked me about how we're adjusting to the downturn and reductions in staff, et cetera, but we haven't reduced our commitment to policy work here in the States or our international policy team, so that's different in the past. And we really want to draw on all our good work around the world in the field that will give policymakers confidence in terms of forest and ecosystems as part of climate policy. So we're going to do our best. I think we have a long way to go. We would not, don't interpret these comments as me bragging. I think we have a kind of humble perspective about where we are right now here, but we're doing everything we can. We think we made a difference in U.S. CAP. We're proud of that. U.S. CAP, you know, this is a compromise, 25 companies, 5 NGOs. I think it's impressive that we reached a compromise. No one participant in U.S. CAP would say that's my best set of recommendations, but it's been a very effective way to get the attention of the Obama team and Congress because it shows, in at least some respects, big business and NGOs can agree on a path forward. And we're going to do everything we can, Carter. We have a lot more work to do, but we're going to do everything we can.
Amy Seidel, author of Early Spring. Mark, I want to talk about strategy and conservation strategy. In year 2004, Chris Thomas published a paper that predicted an average of 25% of the world's species going extinct by 2050 due to climate change alone. So here we are in the midst of an extinction crisis. We have a driver like climate change just barreling down and exacerbating, right, amplifying the extinction we're already seeing. But we also have an irreversible century of warming ahead of us, an epoch of warming, perhaps extending well into the millennia. How do we come up with conservation policy that uses those predictions, that even takes their realm of uncertainty and certainty and begins to plan for the kinds of massive migration and huge ecosystem level change, poleward migration, elevational migration, loss of communities, and somehow, in a fragmented landscape so different from climate change periods in the past, maintains the constituents of ecosystems so that, you know, the well-being of human and non-human life is really preserved?
Yeah, so of course, a great question. And you know, I'm not going to pretend to be the world's authority here, but we're a science-driven organization. We've got 500 scientists thinking hard about that stuff all the time. But most of the work we do, I believe, addresses those worrisome issues that you anticipate in your question. You know, for example, a recent transaction we did, so this is kind of an old-fashioned conservancy deal writ large. We recently closed on a purchase in Montana of more than 300,000 acres for a purchase price of $500 million, so a staggeringly big deal. But it's a corridor, if you will. It's a huge corridor, and it bumps up right into BC. And there's all sorts of, you know, megafauna in that corridor, grizzly bears, et cetera. And you know, part of the thinking there is as climate change occurs, there are pathways for species to migrate north and survive. Certainly, in protecting a big area like the Great Bear I just described would be part of that too. I don't know if any of you were in the poverty session this morning. My colleague Sanjan talked about our work in the Solomon Islands. He just came back from a visit. This is a small conservation project, but it's to protect marine habitat, coral reefs. And our scientists have identified coral that they believe, I don't really understand this is what I'm told, they believe they've identified coral that it better withstands the effects of heating, climate change. And so we're doing everything we can in the Coral Triangle to protect that coral reef because it's got a better chance of survival. So it's driving our thinking. And you talked about species. Sanjay talked about this. It's a fantastic little program. Didn't cost us much money. Human livelihood immediately enhanced. Per capita income going up. The kids, the families in our marine protected areas, more of their kids are going to school. So it's a really great story. But we also think it's protecting the reefs in a way that has in mind climate change. And biodiversity is improving. So Sanjay talked about, the nesting sea turtles. The numbers are way up. So our answer to your question, what do we do about all the risks, is we've got to do more of the conservation projects that we've done at a bigger scale as fast as we can. It's kind of sad looking backwards, to be sure. We've protected a lot of habitat, and climate change might really screw up those plans. Well, what can we do? We've got to do what we can to protect more habitat. We've got to do what we can for Carter's questions to mitigate, do what we can to be an advocate for reduced emissions, and we've got to do what we can to adapt in a way that makes sense from a the perspective of nature, and we think we're pretty well positioned for that. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to do it as practically as we can, as fast as we can, and on as big a scale as we can.
Hi, I'm Carrie Norton. I'm a consultant to early stage entrepreneurs in the green tech space. And my question is sort of two-part. One is, what have you been able to do in terms of leveraging the work and skills that you did at Goldman in terms of ways of measuring success? So, how have you been able to transpose that learning into your work at the Conservancy? And second part is, despite the fact that I think competition is really healthy among organizations, and agree with your philosophy about letting 1,000 flowers bloom, it seems to me like because of the urgency of the situation, so much more leverage could be done if there were more collaboration among the conservation organizations, and to amplify some of the partnerships you're already working on with companies. What's your perspective on that?
Okay, so you asked a few things. First, you asked about how I'm doing. I don't know. I hope I'm doing well. I think the Conservancy Board, I really give them a lot of credit for hiring somebody like me. I think for big nonprofits at least, to experiment with having some business people, private sector folks in management jobs, I think that's smart. It's one more reason I really hope I'm successful, because I'd hate to be an example of this being a bad decision. I think the nonprofit world will benefit from having more private sector experience. And by the way, when I was at Goldman Sachs, it's kind of a long story, but anyway, we did this really cool transaction in Chile to protect this land we had, but we had no idea what we were doing, so we started talking to NGOs to get advice, and we said, wow, these NGOs are so smart. We learned so much from NGOs. So it's really healthy, I think, for the private sector and the nonprofit sector to spend more time together. So that's one thing you asked. And then about collaboration with other organizations. We're for collaboration, and I think we're pretty good collaborators. And I don't mean TNC, I mean CI, WWF, WCS. And increasingly, we're working a lot with environmental defense and NRDC, people like that. But you got to be careful about overdoing it, too, because collaboration is not always a path toward efficiency. Collaboration can be a path toward, lots of meetings and conference rooms and extra big teams and getting less done. Because again, there's urgency to our work. We want to move fast and be nimble. So we're for collaboration if it makes sense. We're certainly for collaboration if it allows for greater efficiency, and it can. And so that kind we're really for. But we're not for collaboration's sake. Sometimes our donors just push us to collaborate, and I push back. I say, listen, be more sophisticated than that. Push for collaboration that enhances returns on your donations, because it's so it's not always that easy. The same is true, by the way, in the private sector. How often do you see companies collaborate? You see it when it makes sense, but not any more than that. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Hi, I'm Jack Riggs with the Aspen Institute. I have two quick questions. The first one, when you were describing being up in the Great Bear Area, watching the bears and eating the little fish, why was that different from Wall Street?
Very good question. Touché.
My more serious question is about the policy work that the Conservancy does, and thinking about Sylvia Earle's question at lunch about, could we turn some of our national forests into national parks? or create more marine reserves and so on. It seems to me that would be the place where the Conservancy would be most effective in working on public policy. Do you do a lot in terms of trying to create protected areas?
We do.
U.S.
So
and nation?
we do. So I'm going to answer your question in two parts, though. Before I get to protected areas, I want to return to what Carter was talking about and RED, avoided deforestation. And I think Carter and I might disagree a little bit about priorities, but I think we're in sync at the end of the day. If international climate policy can include provisions for regulated entities in developed countries to meet their cap by paying for avoided deforestation in developing countries, that could be the hugest idea ever in conservation history. The dollar flows could be enormous and dwarf anything we've done to date. So we're focused like a laser on that because that's huge. Dollars from the rich countries flowing to developing countries to protect rainforests for purposes of sequestering carbon, but also for biodiversity purposes and also for human livelihood purposes and also just for fairness. All that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it didn't come from the developing countries, it came from us. So that's a huge idea. So we really like that one. Protected areas is a little bit different because we say at our place a lot, we want to protect nature for people, not from people. So old-fashioned protected areas, I don't really know how much of a future they have. So the Great Bear example I talked about, that's a big, huge working landscape. Now, there aren't that many people there, but it's intended to make it work for people. But here's a kind of cool deal we're doing. And we need help, so it's a good one for me to talk about. This is Costa Rica. Now, and it has to do with the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, the convention is interesting. Almost every country in the world has signed it, except for a couple. Like Libya hasn't signed, Iraq hasn't signed, and the United States of America hasn't signed. So it's profoundly embarrassing to be in Europe and to talk about this, but hopefully we'll get our act together. But the convention calls for every country to protect 10% of its habitat, just like our goal, on a permanently financed and a basis that will endure. But nobody's really done it. So we're doing a project with President Arias in Costa Rica right now. And so President Arias is a really interesting guy. He got a Nobel Prize for his peace initiative. He disbanded the Costa Rican army. And at the time, it was a part of the world where there's so much war. He disbanded his army unilaterally, and it led to great breakthroughs in peace in the region. His term is coming to an end, and he would like to leave with his new initiative. He calls it Peace with Nature. It's really very moving to hear him talk about it. And so we've cooked up this program with him to raise a bunch of private money, following the example of Great Bear. We're going to lever that into some public money. And the idea is to permanently protect, per the Convention on Biological Diversity in Costa Rica, they'll live up to the standard, 10%. And the place they have a lot of work to do is in the marine protected areas. And the deal is just like in Great Bear. So we've got to raise about $50 million by the end of the year. We're about 2/3 of the way through. Bad year to be doing this. So any big donors out there who want to join a cool project, let us know. And we have a great team. We have the Moore Foundation, which is led by Steve McCormick, my predecessor at the Conservancy. We have the Walton Foundation. We have Larry Linden, who is a former colleague of mine at Goldman Sachs in the Conservancy. Really cool project. But the idea is it's kind of a protected area in Costa Rica. Why are we so excited about it? Because we hope then that we can lever that example into comparable work in other countries. So for example, we were talking to officials in Mexico about this project, and they kind of scoffed. They said, Costa Rica, small country, easy to do there. And we said, great, I think it's easy. Let's try to do it in Mexico. So that's what we're going to try to do. So we are going to, we'll see how we do. We're going to try to use the Convention on Biological Diversity as a thing to campaign around to create more protected areas. But we're also going to fight for dollars in international climate programs to protect the environment as well.
Hi, my name is John McBride, and I live in this valley. And I want to bring a discussion back to the rapidly growing Rocky Mountain West, and particularly this state and this valley. I want to know what you might be doing to change public policy and tax policy, which effectively is destroying a great deal of the West. And let me explain what I mean. Take Colorado, for instance. There's no such thing as agricultural zoning in this whole state. And there is a bill called Senate Bill 35, which enables every farmer or rancher to convert his property to a subdivision without any local approval. Consequently, at time of death or gift to a family member, that property is valued as a subdivision and disappears as a farm or ranch. We lose about 200 square miles a year in Colorado. The problem exists throughout the West. We have a tax which is an anticipatory tax, anticipating subdivision, so that's how everything is taxed and evaluated. Consequently, as you know, the West is growing very fast, and we're losing lots of open land right and left to suburbia. Are you working to try to modify things like Senate Bill 35 to protect open lands, farms and ranches, and further to do anything to change the tax code so that instead of being an anticipatory tax, it is a tax at the time of conversion?
Could I ask just a quick question about that for a second? I don't know Colorado politics as well as I'd like, but in the state of Virginia, we have conservation easements, which have been very effective tools to deal with the problems you're talking about. Does Colorado have a state program for conservation easements?
We do have it here, and there's a remarkable phenomenon that's happened in this valley and in and around other resorts, where conserved land is even more valuable than potentially developed land. And so the hope that it would lower values significantly has been modified by previous sales that have been rather extraordinary, and that's throughout the West.
But in Virginia, when you go into a conservation easement, your land automatically goes into agricultural use, which is a significant reduction in property tax.
That's right, and the same thing could be the case here. However, a large estate, let's say on 300 or 500 acres, can have more value than 30 home sites on that same property. This is something I don't think people ever anticipate, but that's true in Taos and Lander and Jackson Hole and throughout the West. It's a strange phenomenon. In Europe, of course, if land qualifies as agriculture, the tax is 1 or 2% times the number of acres they have for the established ag value, and there isn't even an appraisal. So farmland stays farmland until everybody agrees it should be converted, but not here.
I'm sorry, I'm just
You
curious.
know, it's a great question because I'm glad you asked it. I don't really know a lot about what we're doing in Colorado. I'll use a lifeline here. Charles, can you? So anyway, Charles Bedford. It's a question I'm glad you asked because that kind of stuff is core to Conservancy. So here's Charles Bedford. He's our state director in Colorado. So you might as well hear from our local man on the scene. Charles, I hope you were listening to the question, Charles.
Right. What was that again, John? Thanks, John. John and I have talked about this quite a bit. There's two questions that John brings up. Really, one is this the minimum size that you can get away with subdividing land in Colorado, and that's 35 acres, and that's a state law. And that's one that we've been, it's just this chronic issue in Colorado, whether you can move public policy to allow for or to allow local governments really to regulate the subdivision of land, at greater increments than just that 35 acres and less piece. We're part of an early coalition last fall to discuss this, but the agricultural community is quite split on this issue, and without the agricultural community coming along with it, it really won't make it anywhere in the State House. So the conversation is still going, and I think in the last 20 years, as this issue has come to the head, a number of times, this is probably the first cycle that we've actually had a sense that there may be some room for compromise. Notably, John, Wyoming, that weird eco-liberal state of Wyoming, has just done the same thing. So there is some hope. They've just gone to 160-acre minimum zoning, which is quite hopeful, actually. And they've done it with the cattle growers and the stock growers in Wyoming, which is great. The other part of the question really is a federal estate tax question, and that has to do with whether or not an estate is valued at its commercial value upon demise and passed on to kids, and then in that case, mostly the kids just have to sell the place. Yeah. And that's one that where we have, I believe, a national position on that sort of on that. I'm not sure it's exactly what John's looking for, which is to have essentially a look-back provision if the land is ever then sold for development. We've been approaching it for 50 years, or as long as conservation easements have been around, from the perspective of doing a conservation easement to reduce the value of the land. The Aspen Valley, I have to say, and other ski areas are a little bit of outliers in the sense of creating value by conservation. But you must it's an interesting indicator, I think, of what conservation does at the same time.
Thanks.
We have
I just wanted to tag team with Charles. I'm Peter Wells, and I'm an old conservancy person, but I'm also on the board of the Land Trust Alliance, and we represent 1,700 conservation groups across America. And to John's point, there was a law that was passed about 8 or 9 years ago called the American Farm and Ranch Protection Act that did enable people to use estate planning tools to protect agricultural lands. The problem with it was oriented around those counties where the biggest major metropolitan areas are in the country. In the state of Colorado, it's all the Front Range counties. And it even allows for a 2-year post-mortem retroactive backwards easement provision in order to protect those lands. So some of it exists, and on the Land Trust Alliance radar screen is to get this across America and just not in those areas where the urban counties are. So it's something that is on the radar screen. So.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Sylvia? And this is our last question because I know some people have to leave and catch a 4:30 plane. Sylvia, thank you.
I'm so pleased to see Nature Conservancy look to the sea, as other organizations are beginning to as well. It's a little more difficult in terms of how do you get your arms around protecting a chunk of the ocean where ownership is an issue. But I serve on the National Parks 21st Century Commission, looking to the future there, much as the topic of this meeting. And I have asked John Fahey at the National Geographic to distribute maps of the real United States to the commission members so they'll get their minds around at least that part of the ocean that is under national jurisdiction. The United States more than doubles in size if you take into consideration the exclusive economic zone, and it's true around the world. Those nations that have a coast do have jurisdiction, and organizations such as Nature Conservancy do have influence in terms of being able to suggest or make a case for or demonstrate the appropriateness of embracing places in the sea that are protected as we are trying to protect places on the land. And I missed the first part of the presentation, so I don't know whether you made the point that 12% or so of the land is protected around the world in some form of conservation umbrella, but in the ocean a fraction of 1%, including the 340,000 square miles of ocean that were recently dedicated as a national monument just in the past 3 years. And that means that even the fish are safe, which is amazing. It's like saying even the animals are safe in a national park. What a concept. And the trees, too. So I guess the question is for you about your ambitions going forward and your objectives going forward, about how the mighty powers of Nature Conservancy and the other organizations that you influence might look to the sea in ways to more fully embrace protected areas and protective policies, because we literally have one chance, a narrow window, to get it right.
Thanks for your question, Sylvia. And it's an honor, I guess, to be asked a question by you about our work in the marine area. Before you got here, I think I said the Conservancy's focused on all habitat types, and that includes marine, of course. It's true historically we began as a land trust, so we have some catching up to do. So it's a shame we didn't start earlier. But we're very committed to our marine practice. We're doing a bunch of stuff in the Coral Triangle. It's reef-related generally, but we're doing interesting work in sustainable fisheries. So we're going to do everything we can. We have a long way to go. But in the same spirit we attack the other stuff we're taking on, so we will go into the marine sphere. And, mighty powers of TNC, we don't always feel that powerful, but we do feel obligation. Chris asked me about our downsizing, and it's true we've downsized, but we're still an enormously well-resourced conservation organization. And so when I say that, I'm not bragging. I'm saying to my colleagues here in the room, we have a huge obligation to take full advantage of that opportunity than we have. We have a responsibility. We're bigger than everybody else. We have a longer history than everybody else. We better get this right. We have no excuses. And our donors, let us do what we do. So, I interpret your question, Sylvia, as a challenge, and we welcome the challenge. We're going to do everything we can. We can't do it on our own. Lots of folks have asked about collaboration with others. We're sincerely interested in collaborating. Well, as you can tell, we'll collaborate with anybody if it helps us get our mission done. And we're really grateful for everybody's support. I guess my closing comments would be to all of you, if you're not engaged with a conservation organization, you ought to do so. It's really amazing. I travel around and meet our supporters. Oftentimes they get involved because they care about something in their backyard, and they're not really interested so much in biodiversity conservation. They just want to protect something that's near them. But then they get into it. And in organizations like ours, but it's true for the other guys too, so I don't mean just us, you can really roll up your sleeves and get engaged. You can support us financially, but you can dig in and help us. We fight for stuff. We look for supporters, and it's a movement more than anything else. So, and then the people who get into it love it. It changes their lives. So if you're one of them, thank you. And if you're not, give it a shot. But we really appreciate your support. And you're very nice to come here in this dark room on a beautiful afternoon in Aspen. So thanks a lot.
Mark, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for great questions and for your time. And get out there and get some sunshine.